All right, welcome everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into something super important, like the foundation of how we understand kids, how they grow, how they learn. We're talking research methods in child development.
Yeah, exactly.
We're going to be using excerpts from this research manual in child development, second edition. I mean, it's all about getting into the nitty-gritty of how researchers actually go about studying kids.
Yeah.
The tools they use, the big studies that have really shaped our knowledge. It's kind of like a behind the scenes look at all the work that goes into understanding how kids develop.
Yeah, absolutely. And how, we go from just watching kids to actually making theories about how they grow and change and then
Yeah,
testing those theories out. It's the whole scientific process.
totally. So let's get started with that. Like, how does this whole scientific inquiry thing, how does it actually begin when you're dealing with kids?
Well, I mean, just like any scientific field, right? You start with observing, right? Like researchers just spend a lot of time watching kids, watching their behavior, how they interact with each other, their development. They start to look for patterns. I mean, think about it. Like you might observe that babies start babbling and then they start forming words.
Right. We see these things that happen consistently.
Yeah, yeah. So from these patterns, right, they start to come up with ideas, and we call these theories. A theory tries to explain, why these patterns exist. So, for instance, a theory about language development might try to explain why babies follow that sequence of babbling to words, maybe by looking at how their brains are developing or how they learn from the language they hear around them.
So the theory is like the why behind the what that we see.
Exactly,
That
exactly.
doesn't just stop there, right?
No, no, not at all. A good theory is going to predict new things. And that leads to, what we call hypotheses. These are like the specific testable predictions based on the theory. So researchers design studies to test out these hypotheses. And then the results might support the theory. They might suggest it needs to be tweaked, or it might lead to new theories altogether. It's this constant cycle of observing and explaining and testing.
It's like this constant puzzle,
Yeah.
adding pieces, trying to figure out how kids tick.
Exactly. And the manual, makes a point of saying that having a lot of that initial information, accumulated data, it's really important for even being able to come up with good hypotheses in the first place.
Okay, can you give an example of that, in terms of studying kids?
Yeah, totally. Let's say you have a researcher and they're spending hours just observing babies around 5 months old.
Yeah.
They might notice something super interesting happening just before a baby spills their milk. It's not just, that they lose their grip. Like maybe the researcher sees that the baby is reaching for a toy with one hand, but at the same time, like looking intently at a colorful mobile across the room and maybe even kicking their legs excitedly. So this kind of detailed record of actions that, on the surface might seem unrelated can actually lead the researcher to new ideas maybe about how babies manage their attention, or how their motor skills are linked to their focus. It's like that initial detailed picture. It really sparks that light bulb moment.
It shows you just how much, being really attuned to those details matters.
Absolutely.
But I bet studying something as complex and, just constantly evolving as a child's development, like, that's going to come with its own set of unique challenges.
Yeah, you're totally right. Psychological events, in children, their emotions, their thoughts, their social interactions, they're super intricate. And they're always changing. It's not always easy to pick out one specific thing to study. Like, think about a child's mood. It can shift in seconds. And there's so much going on. Internal feelings, external behaviors.
So how do researchers even begin to approach something that's so dynamic?
They often have to kind of break down these complex events, these continuous events into smaller parts that they can really investigate. So they identify specific aspects, variables that kind of represent that psychological event and the stuff going on around it.
And the manual points out this distinction between internal events, like what a child's thinking, versus external events, like what they're doing.
Yeah.
How do researchers approach those differently?
Yeah, totally. So internal events, like thoughts and feelings, you can't actually see them. I mean, if a child's old enough, you can ask them, get their verbal report. But with younger kids, or even with thoughts a child might not be aware of, researchers have to make inferences based on what they can see, their behavior, their facial expressions.
Makes sense, right? Like, if you can't ask a toddler what they're thinking, you watch how they react.
Exactly.
Now, about these external events, the things we can see, the manual talks about needing a reliable description. Why is that so important?
Because in research, right, we need to describe stuff in a way that's consistent. So different researchers watching the same thing would agree on what happened. If everyone's describing it differently, it's impossible to see any real patterns. The manual
Yeah.
gives this funny example of UFO sightings. Like, people report them, but because there's no consistency in descriptions, it's really hard to study them scientifically.
Right, you need some level of agreement on what's happening before you can study it.
E-
So when researchers are looking at these psychological events and the context around them, what are they trying to figure out ultimately?
They're looking for relationships. If they consistently find that when one thing happens, another thing also tends to happen, like let's say children who are taught in a specific way show faster progress in reading,
Yeah.
then you can start to make some connections, make inferences about how those things are related. But like the manual really stresses, how strong those connections are depends entirely on how carefully the information was gathered in the first place.
So the how is super key. Let's dive into that. Like, what are the different research designs and methods out there when studying child development?
Oh, there's a ton. Like you have experimental designs where researchers actually change things to see what happens, manipulating those independent variables to see their effect on the dependent variables. And there are different types of experimental designs, like the manual talks about factorial designs, where you might be testing a bunch of factors at the same time, and functional designs, where you're looking at how changing the amount or intensity of something impacts the outcome.
So those are different from just observing what happens in a natural setting, right?
Exactly. Naturalistic observation. You're watching kids in their everyday environments. The researcher isn't messing with anything. It's great for seeing how kids really act, like authentically, the high ecological validity.
Uh-huh.
But it can be harder to say definitively what causes what because so much is happening all at once.
Makes sense. What if, researchers just want to see if two things are related without trying to change anything?
That's where correlational research comes in. You measure things, see if they tend to go together. Like, is there a connection between TV time and vocabulary size? But, as the manual warns, just because two things are correlated doesn't mean one causes the other. There could be another factor involved.
That's a really important thing to remember when we hear about any research, right?
Absolutely.
Now, the manual also lists these different designs: cross-sectional, longitudinal, and time lag. Can you break this down for us?
These are about how you look at development over time. Cross-sectional, you look at different age groups all at once. Longitudinal, you follow the same group of kids as they get older. Time lag is less common, comparing groups of the same age, but born in different years.
Got it. And the Solomon 4 group design, that sounds like a mouthful. What's that all about?
Oh, that one's clever. It helps you see if giving a pretest at the beginning of a study actually changes how people respond later on.
Yeah.
So you have 4 groups. 2 get pretested, treatment, post-test. 1 gets just treatment and post-test. And the last one, just post-test. By comparing them, you can see if that pretest messed things up.
Wow. It seems like researchers have to be super careful about all these things that could affect their results.
Yeah, it's really important.
And speaking of being careful, when setting up a study, you have to be really clear about what you're actually studying. The manual talks about operational definitions. What are those?
Oh, those are key. It's like a recipe, a super specific one, for how you're going to measure something in your study. The manual actually has this funny example about, someone saying they had an easy and fast delivery of a baby, but then you find out the doctor considered it a hard labor from the baby's side. So, even simple terms can have different meanings.
An operational definition makes sure everyone understands exactly what's being measured. Like if we're studying aggression, our operational definition would say exactly what behaviors count. Hitting, pushing, yelling.
Precision is everything.
Um,
No room for ambiguity.
Exactly. You want everyone on the same page.
What are some other challenges researchers run into?
Well, getting a truly representative sample of kids can be tough. Because of ethics, a lot of research relies on volunteers, parents willing to let their kids participate. But those families might be different in some way from those who don't volunteer. That bias makes it harder to apply the findings to all kids. Yeah, you're right. The group you're studying might not perfectly reflect everyone. And speaking of ethics, that's got to be a huge concern when you're dealing with kids, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the manual spends a lot of time on ethics. One tricky area is deception. Sometimes, researchers might need to keep some information from kids so it doesn't affect their behavior.
Mhm.
But any deception has to be justified, and it can't cause the kid anxiety or distress, and it has to be explained later on.
Right. It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And it's not just what you say to kids, right? The manual talks about nonverbal cues, too.
Oh, for sure. Researchers have to be aware of their body language, their tone of voice, how close they are to the kid. All these things can accidentally influence a child's responses. Like the manual even says to avoid being too enthusiastic or friendly, especially with older kids, because it might make them suspicious.
Makes you think about all those subtle things.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
So how do researchers actually find kids to participate in their studies?
Well, there are a few ways, right? They might work with schools, nursery schools, daycare centers, public and private schools. They can reach out to places like recreation programs or even parent groups, like LeMays for younger kids. It's all about building those relationships, building that trust.
But before any of the research with kids can even start, there's a super important step, right?
Oh, yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. Before you can collect any data, you have to get approval from what's called the Human Subjects Research Committee, or an IRB institutional review board. They review the whole plan to make sure it's ethical and that the kids' well-being and rights are protected.
Makes sense. And what are some of those rights that kids who participate in research, what are they entitled to?
Well, there are a few key ones. First is the right to be protected from harm, both physical and psychological. Then there's the right to informed consent, which usually means getting permission from their parents or guardians. And if the kid is old enough to understand, they have the right to give their own assent to participate too. It has to be voluntary.
Hmm.
And they have the right to know the general results of the study. And of course, everything they share has to be kept confidential.
So many safeguards in place.
Yeah, really important.
The manual mentions a place researchers can find info about psychological tests they might want to use.
Right, yeah. The American Psychological Association, their science directorate, they have a resource called Finding Information About Psychological Tests. It's a great place to start if you're looking for good ways to measure things in child development.
Okay, so we've gotten a pretty good overview of the whole scientific process in child development research. Now let's zoom in a bit.
Okay.
Let's start with observational studies. What are the different types researchers use?
Oh, there are several, and they each focus on different things. You have sequential protocols, which are super detailed, recording actions moment by moment, just what's happening, no interpretation at that stage. Then there are topical reports, which are a little broader, describing behavior and often relating it back to developmental theories, like Piaget or Ainsworth.
So sequential is like a close-up and topical is like a wide shot.
Exactly. Good analogy.
What else is there?
Well, you have time sampling, where you watch at specific times, maybe rotating between kids. Then event sampling, where you focus on recording particular events whenever they occur. Specimen records try to create a rich, detailed story of a child's behavior. And lastly, trait rating scales, which use a summary of observations to rate a kid on certain characteristics.
Okay, so much variety. And observer reliability, that's got to be a big deal in these studies.
Oh, absolutely. To check this, you often have multiple observers watching the same thing, and then you see how much they agree. If they're new to this or trying to observe too much at once, the agreement's usually lower. Focusing on fewer specific behaviors helps a lot.
Like, if everyone's looking for the same thing, they're more likely to see it the same way. Can you give an example of what you might focus on in a sequential protocol?
Sure. Let's say you're studying how a toddler learns to feed themselves. So you'd record actions like child picks up spoon, child brings spoon to mouth, food falls off spoon, child opens mouth, food enters mouth, and so on. You're just sticking to those observable actions, not jumping to conclusions about, if the kid is hungry or frustrated or enjoying it.
Okay, and what about topical reports? What kind of info would you typically find in one?
Those usually cover these big areas of development. So like for physical and motor development, you might describe the child's gross and fine motor skills. For cognitive development, you might note their problem-solving or language use. For social and emotional development, you could describe how they interact with others, how they express feelings. And you might include observations about the home environment, how they act there. Like if you were looking at attachment, you might relate your observations to Ainsworth's criteria, noting how the child reacts when a caregiver leaves and returns.
The manual also mentions APGAR scores and the Prechtel and Bientema assessment. Where do those fit in?
Those are special tools used with newborns and really young infants. The APGAR scores are a quick way to assess a newborn's physical condition right after birth, like heart rate, breathing, muscle tone. And the Prechtel and Bientema, that's a more detailed way to classify an infant's states, like different types of sleep and wakefulness. It can tell us about their neurological development.
And what about time sampling? Rotating observations, what kinds of behaviors have been studied using that technique?
Oh, tons. Like how much kids play together versus alone, how often they do certain things like hitting or sharing, even broader categories of activity. It's about getting these snapshots in time.
Got it. And trait rating scales, those are based more on the researcher's overall impression, right? Like, can you give an example of a trait they might rate?
Yeah, for sure. So they might want to rate a child's shyness over a few weeks. Instead of counting every shy behavior, they'd use their observations to give the kid a rating, from like not shy at all to very shy.
Okay, so it's like a summary rating.
Exactly.
The manual gives this cool example of a project focusing on sex-typed play behavior. What did that involve?
Yeah, that one aimed to watch how kids play, categorize it based on whether the activities were typically seen as more boyish or girlish.
Yeah.
So they had categories for the type of activity, like dolls versus trucks, the language they used, the emotions, the toys, even the makeup of the group, same sex or mixed. And they'd record how often they saw these things, often using tally marks. This way you can start asking questions about, how boys and girls differ in their play, how those preferences change as they get older, and how it all connects to ideas about gender.
And this kind of observational stuff can even be used for things like, analyzing TV shows for kids.
Right, like looking at how much violence there is or the portrayal of stereotypes based on sex or race. They have these coding systems, to define what counts as violence, the character's traits, the family structures, and so on. And again, it's super important to make sure multiple observers agree on how to use those codes.
Makes sense. And for researchers who want to see what's already been done, the manual mentions those information retrieval systems. What are those?
Oh, those are super helpful, like PsycInfo and PsychScans. They're these huge databases with summaries of tons of research in psychology. Articles, books. You can search them to find previous studies on a specific topic, see what others have found. The PsychScans focus on more recent stuff, which is handy.
Cool. So that covers a lot on observational studies. Let's switch gears to experimental studies, starting with psychomotor and perceptual behavior. The manual talks about reaction time, which seems to be making a comeback.
Yeah, it is. Reaction time, basically how long it takes you to respond to something. It's been studied forever. It's getting popular again because it gives us this direct look into cognitive processes, like how fast we can detect and process information.
And the manual describes experiment 1, looking at age and sex differences in 2 reaction time tasks. What were those tasks?
Okay, so in this one, you had different groups of kids doing one of 2 tasks. One was simple, lift your finger when a light comes on. The other, the C reaction time task, was a little harder. 2 lights, but only lift your finger when a specific one turns on. So they had this device with lights and buttons, and they measured how fast the kid reacted to the light.
And what were they hoping to learn from that?
The idea is that the C reaction task requires an extra step, right? You don't just react, you have to decide if it's the right light. So by comparing those times, you can get a sense of how long that decision-making takes. And they wanted to see how that changes as kids get older and if there are any differences between boys and girls.
And how did they analyze the data?
They calculated the average reaction time
Mm.
and how much the times varied within each group, using standard deviations. Then they used this statistical test called ANOVA, which tells you if the differences between groups are meaningful, not just random. It gives you an F ratio and a p-value. A low p-value, usually below 0.05, means the differences are statistically significant.
Got it. So that's how they look at basic motor skills. Now onto cognitive development and Piaget's theory. The manual mentions this shift towards theory-driven research. Why was that important?
Early on, a lot of the research was just descriptive, like what kids could do at different ages. But then there was this push to understand why, the mechanisms behind their thinking. Theories like Piaget's provided a framework, an explanation, so researchers could start testing hypotheses, really digging into how kids' minds work.
And Piaget's theory is like the OG, right?
Totally. He saw kids as active learners, constructing their understanding through their own experiences. He said 2 things drive this organization: our tendency to create systems in our thoughts, and adaptation, how we adjust to new stuff. And adaptation involves 2 things: assimilation, where we fit new info into our existing ideas, and accommodation, where we change those ideas to fit the new info.
Okay, so assimilation is fitting it in, and accommodation is changing your ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And Piaget also talked about this idea of equilibration, which is basically this drive to keep those 2 things balanced.
And those processes lead to what he called schemas. What are those again?
Schemas are like mental models, or patterns of thought and action that kids use to understand and interact with the world. For babies, it might be something simple, like the sucking reflex. But as kids grow, these schemas get more complex and flexible.
And of course, we can't talk about Piaget without mentioning his stages of development.
Right. He had four main stages. First is sensorimotor, from birth to around 2 years old. This is when babies learn through their senses and actions. Big milestones are like object permanence, knowing things exist even when you can't see them, and attentional actions. Towards the end, they start forming mental representations. Then comes pre-operational, roughly from 2 to 7. Now, they can use symbols, like language, but their thinking is very egocentric. They have a hard time seeing things from others' perspectives. They also struggle with conservation, the idea that the amount of something stays the same, even if you change how it looks.
Okay, so they're really focused on their own viewpoint at that stage.
Yeah, and the next stage is concrete operational, from about 7 to 11. This is where they start thinking more logically about concrete stuff. They understand reversibility, they can group things, and they get seriation, which is putting things in order. And finally, formal operational. Starting in adolescence and into adulthood, this is where abstract thought comes in, hypotheticals, deductive reasoning.
So much development. Piaget's theory is really influential, but it has had its critics.
Yeah, for sure. Like, some researchers say kids might develop certain abilities earlier than Piaget thought, depending on how you test them. And the idea of stages, some argue it's more of a continuous process. And the exact ways Piaget said kids move from one stage to the next. Well, there are other explanations for that too, focusing on things like biological maturation, experience, social interaction.
So there's always ongoing debate and refinement.
Always. It's how science works.
The manual talks about experiment 2, the Three Mountains task, for studying spatial perspective taking. This is classic Piaget.
Yeah, it is. It's a well-known technique, adapted from Piaget and Inhelder. It's meant to look at egocentrism, that difficulty taking another person's view. So you have this model of 3 mountains, each one's different. The kid sits in one spot and a doll is in another. Then the child has to describe what the doll sees, maybe pick a picture or arrange objects to match the doll's view. And then researchers look for specific mistakes they make.
Interesting. And what kinds of questions have they explored using this task?
They've looked at how perspective taking develops with age, if there are differences between boys and girls, the kinds of errors kids make. This particular experiment also suggests seeing if kids enjoy different parts of the task. Piaget saw trouble with this task as proof of egocentrism. But later research found that kids might be better at perspective taking than he initially thought, depending on how you test them.
So the way you ask the question matters.
It really does.
The manual mentions this idea of decentering, moving beyond your own view. What's the significance of that?
Decentering is a big deal, for social and emotional development. Being able to see that others have different perspectives, literally and figuratively. It's linked to empathy, understanding others' feelings, and even altruism, acting in ways that help others.
Okay, that makes sense. Next up, we have the concept of theory of mind. What exactly is that?
Theory of mind is basically our ability to understand that other people have their own thoughts, beliefs, desires, their own internal stuff going on, and that these things can be different from our own and can influence how they act. It's realizing that people have minds, and those minds contain their own versions of the world.
So it's realizing that other people aren't just robots, basically.
Right, exactly. They have their own inner world.
And the manual talks about the false belief task as a way to assess this. How does that work?
Okay, so the classic false belief task, it usually involves a little story. Like, you show a kid a scene where, let's say, someone named Maxie puts chocolate in a cupboard. Then while Maxie's gone, someone else moves the chocolate to a different cupboard. Now, when Maxie comes back, you ask the kid where Maxie will look for the chocolate. If a child has developed theory of mind, they understand that Maxie will wrongly think it's still in the first cupboard. But younger kids, they often say Maxie will look in the new spot because they know where it really is, and they haven't grasped that Maxie's belief is different from their own knowledge.
It's amazing how this simple story can tell us so much about how kids understand other people's minds.
Yeah, it really is.
And the manual mentions some factors that are thought to influence this development.
Oh yeah, there are a few. Things like, basic cognitive abilities, like memory and attention, a child's overall information processing speed, how big their family is, and even specific things like being able to inhibit your own perspective. And research is also showing that culture plays a role. Social and cultural experiences matter too.
So nature and nurture are both at work.
Exactly. It's always a combination.
And experiment 3 in the manual focuses on this false belief. What were they looking at there?
They were basically trying to see how understanding a false belief develops. They probably gave kids of different ages a false belief task, like that Maxie story, and then compared their performance. The idea is that older preschoolers would do better than younger ones, showing that theory of mind develops over time, and they might have looked at differences between boys and girls too.
So digging deeper into those age-related changes. Okay, we've covered so much. Now, on to attention. The manual talks about a renewed interest in studying attention. Why is that?
Attention was big early on in psychology, but then it kind of took a back seat. But now, with cognitive psychology and neuroscience, there's this huge focus on understanding how we choose and process information, the basic mechanics. Attention is key for so much else, like learning, memory, problem solving. And brain imaging has allowed us to actually look at what's happening in the brain, which is really exciting.
Makes sense. And experiment 4 uses a version of the Stroop color word test to look at interference proneness. First off, what is the Stroop test?
Oh, it's a classic. It's about selective attention, being able to control what you focus on. So you see words printed in different colors, like the word blue in red ink. And you have to say the color of the ink, not the word itself. The Stroop effect is that it's harder to do this when the word and the color don't match. Like it takes longer to say red when you're looking at the word blue printed in red. It's because reading is automatic, so it interferes with naming the color. By using this with kids, researchers can see how they get better at controlling their attention as they get older.
And what were the hypotheses in experiment 4 about how interference proneness changes with age and between boys and girls?
Well, they probably figured that interference would decrease as kids get older. They get better at focusing on the color and ignoring the word. And they might have looked at whether boys and girls differed at different ages. They also might have compared how fast kids could read the words versus just naming the colors. Those speeds can affect how strong the Stroop effect is.
So how do they actually measure this interference proneness?
Okay, so they used different cards. Some had colored X's, just to measure how fast they could name colors. Others had color words, some matching the ink, some not. Kids had to name the ink color as fast as they could or read the words. Then they calculated interference by comparing the time for mismatched word color pairs to the time for just naming the colors of the X's. The bigger the difference or ratio, the more interference there was. The manual specifically says they calculated a difference score and a ratio score using the times for those different types of cards.
Okay, on to experiment 5, which looks at picture word semantic interference. What's that all about?
This one's based on a study by Rosinski, Galinkoff, and Kukish, and it looks at how the meaning of words and pictures can kind of mess with each other in our brains. You see pictures and words either related, like a picture of a dog and the word dog, or unrelated, like a dog picture and the word cat. And you have to either name the picture or read the word as fast as you can. Researchers want to see if there are age differences in this effect, if it's easier to name pictures or read words, and how matching or mismatching affects how quickly kids respond.
So are they basically trying to trip the kids up a bit?
Kinda, yeah. It's all about seeing how those meanings interact.
What were their main hypotheses?
They probably thought reading would be faster, especially for older kids who are good readers, and that responses would be faster overall for older kids. But the main thing is about that interference. They probably figured it'd take longer to respond when the picture and word didn't match because the meanings would clash in their minds, and they'd want to see if that effect was different for different ages or between naming pictures and reading words.
Makes sense. And how did they set it up, especially with those matching and mismatching pairs?
So it involves kids from different age groups. The manual focuses on 2nd and 6th graders, but each kid did both picture naming and word reading. And for each task, they saw both matching and mismatching picture-word pairs. To make it fair, they mixed up the order, so some kids saw matching pairs first, some saw mismatching pairs first, and then they used a statistical test called a repeated measures ANOVA to compare those conditions. They also had multiple experimenters to make sure it wasn't just one person's style affecting the results, and they carefully timed everything and recorded all the data.
Lots of controls in place.
Yeah, you want to be as rigorous as possible.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to memory. Experiment 6 focuses on recall, specifically organizational strategies in memory. What did they do in that experiment?
This one's all about how kids remember things. So they showed kids these pictures that were grouped into categories like animals, furniture, clothes. Then they had to recall as many as they could. The researchers wrote down their answers, encouraged them to keep going, but didn't give them any hints. The idea was to see how kids naturally organize information in their memory.
And how did they score that? How they recalled the pictures?
They looked at a bunch of things, like the total number they remembered, any extra stuff they added, any repetitions, the categories they used, how many from each category, the order they recalled them in, and even how much they grouped items from the same category together. That's a lot of detail. The idea is to get a sense of their memory strategies. Do they just recall randomly, or do they group things together to help them remember?
So it's not just what they remember, but how they remember it.
Exactly, that's the key here.
And what did they find?
Well, research generally shows that as kids get older, they remember more stuff and they use more of those grouping strategies. This particular experiment doesn't give specific results, but it suggests looking at those age differences and how well